Hello, we're about to begin our States of Splendor podcast number 8. Today's subject is relatively philosophical, as maybe the previous 4 ones were. It's probably going to be the peak of our philosophical discussions, and the rest will be relegated to our private philosophy club. Today's subject is tailor-made, custom-made, custom-designed, vehicles of splendor by authenticity. So in today's podcast, we delve into the subject of custom-made, and custom-made objects are, through technology, today more and more accessible. Custom-made objects are often considered the nec plus ultra of objects because it creates a bond between the creator of the object and the object itself. Now, as technology makes custom design and custom making more accessible, it makes the rarity of such objects go down. But then again, there's some new technological innovations that makes authentication more and more possible through, for example, blockchain technology or even eventually quantum encryption. Now this creates a certain paradox and makes us explore the notions of authenticity, of value, and of splendor. We also will be continuing our Splendor show and tell, which we started in the States of Splendor podcast number 7. As you know, it's showcasing objects, big or small, expensive, inexpensive, it doesn't matter, that we think has splendor. And splendor being a relative concept, it can be any type of object or almost any type of object which we feel has a certain splendor in it. So last podcast we had 4 items, and this time States of Splendor show and tell will have 1 object. So we await your contributions and your submissions because you, the listener, are invited to submit any object that you feel has some splendor. All you have to do is take a few pictures, maybe 5 or 6. If you could take a small video with your phone, it would be appreciated. And you send it along with the story of the object, and we're going to showcase it on our next Splendor show and tell. You can do so at info@statesofsplendor.com. We also will be initiating a new chronicle, which is called the Hindsight Chronicle. In this, we explore a phenomenon of the past. As we'll see today in this podcast, at least half of the splendor in an object is created by the eyes of the beholder. So we will be the eyes of the beholder today, and in hindsight look at a phenomenon that maybe sometimes is overlooked or lesser known, and just admire the splendor within it. Today's Hindsight Chronicle will be examining Fallingwater. If you don't know what that is, I encourage you to continue listening and tune in. Now, as I said, the future philosophical discussions will be relegated to our philosophy club. How do you participate? Because everybody is invited to participate. First of all, through the comments section, and you can also participate in the comment section on our YouTube page or any other video hosting page that we use. You can also do so on our States of Splendor podcasts page, which is accessible obviously at statesofsplendor.com in the podcasts section. Now, the private philosophy club will be accessible to all of the people who contribute financially to our work. If anyone should like to join and participate in our private discussions, know that they're available through our Patreon page. You can find it on our website, statesofsplendor.com. At the bottom of each of our article pages, there's the link to our Patreon page, and those are the people who contribute financially to make it possible for us to continue our work. So each of our patrons will be able to participate in our philosophy club and other kinds of private discussions. So for now, it's Patreon. Maybe if you listen to this podcast in the future, it'll be another such website. You can always keep up to date through our website, statesofsplendor.com. So in advance, we thank you very much for each and every contribution. We're very grateful for it because it helps us to continue our work. So let's get this podcast started by the traditional honk of the States of Splendor boat. And I hope you enjoyed this podcast. See you next time. Bye-bye. Hello, how are you? Welcome to today's SOS Podcast number 8. Today's subject is tailor-made, custom-made, custom-designed vehicles of splendor by authenticity. That's quite a long title, but today's subject is quite substantial subject. In order to go to the root of today's subject, we must delve into human nature a bit and fully grasp the current state of the interlinking between splendor and human motivation. So ancient wisdom of various traditions, as well as newer knowledge, have noted that individuals are split between individuation and commonality. In other words, as we all know, people want a sense of belonging to the group, yet at the same time like to differentiate themselves as individuals. These are two dimensions of lifestyle: adherence to the group norms and individual differentiation. SOS Podcast number 5 was about the urban exodus. In it, there's the theory that states that our tendency to choose or idealize or be motivated by to aim for a certain environment is in fact a reflection of the composition of our interior character, with its complex composition of both good and bad objects. The location where we choose to live is, of course, due to material constraints. However, the location where we would ideally choose to live is motivated by the good and bad objects in our own character. Among those sources of motivation we have, there is the desire to belong to a group. At its opposite, there is the desire for individuation or individual difference. This, in fact, influences our choice of environments, but these two factors also have a major influence in our choice of products, be they physical or cultural. Since the Industrial Revolution, the world has been changing, but also the speed at which it is changing has also been itself increasing with no end. Among the common blessings that these changes have brought, there's been the mass production of goods that have helped fulfill the population's needs, security, health, and comfort. This meant an increase in standardized products, which in turn has created a great rarity of non-standardized and non-mass-produced goods, often the artisanal handmade variety. If we look at many of the world's top luxury products, what do they have in common? Not being mass-produced, and often being handmade. Look at certain brands such as we can look at Ferrari, Dom Perignon champagne, Cuban cigars, fine jewelry, watches, Rolex and Patek Philippe and Cartier. Is it the rarity that makes the price go up? Yes and no. It is the quality as an individual differentiation factor, but also as a sense of belonging, but to a select group, a group that differentiates itself by brand. That's what prestige brands are, an option that only few can choose. Someplace where access is limited and club members recognize each other's membership, outsiders also recognize their membership, visible on, for example, the LV brand insignia or other such badges and points of interest. However, the Nec Plus Ultra has always been the custom-made product. the one that the company makes according to the specifications of the special client. For example, those who listen to the SOS Podcast number 6, The Stuff of Legends, we talked about the famous De La Haye and Bugatti cars of the 1920s. In the 1920s, everyone wanted a Bugatti or a De La Haye, for example. To have one was a sign of success, of course. However, to have a true De La Haye custom made by a professional carrossier according to one's specifications, that is the absolute object of material perfection. This type of product still exists today, but it's even rarer than it would have been in the beginning of the 20th century. Today still, custom made has an aura of desirability. However, the market, thanks to exponentially evolving technology, has shifted and arrived at a new state. The market of truly top-of-the-line custom-made products has become very restrained. This is because of the excessive cost-cutting of the past decades in business and has often come at the expense of quality. The master's hand first starts to be delocalized to lower-wage countries. Then, some try to totally replace it with technology and AI. In the world of mass-produced goods, robotization is welcome because it increases productivity, product regularity, and it often actually increases the quality of the product as such. For top-of-the-line creme de la creme products, the master's hand is in of itself a justification of the price, and more often than not, of its quality. The manual work that goes into an authentic luxury product is often a big part of its prestige. The blood, sweat, and tears that go into a product is actually a part of its value. This is why it's universally recognized that a hand-knotted Persian rug is definitely superior to the machine-made one. True, as some say, in the future, AI could actually do creative work millions of times more powerful and entirely on its own without copying us. However, the object would carry only the prestige of the price of its materials and the price of the machine used to make the product. One could, in order to create rarity, set a limit of production on the creative products of AI. Example, this machine only produces 100 exclusive products, but that really would be an artificial limit, an artificial rarity. One paradox must be noted, however. If the custom-designed object is produced by technology using at its source a digital file, this means that the object produced, though custom-made, will potentially be copied endlessly, which would render this object's uniqueness totally diluted in a sea of copies. By definition, if we wanted to induce a definite recognizable authenticity, the object would have to receive the human intervention of craftsmanship to reveal some unique signature or seal within it. There are those who would argue that today, with the advent of blockchain technology, it could be perfectly possible to give a 3D printed object a unique, non-forgeable, and traceable branding or signature. But the action done using this technology would in fact be the intervention of a third-party artificial intelligence hand in the process, much like the intervention of the craftsman's hand. It would, however, be 100% based on a random decision, having no basis in earthly, palpable reality or in human experience. If you think about it, if we have this 3D printed object, it could, in theory, be completely copied endlessly. But if we want to make it authentic, there's one way, it's just of making it artificially rare, which is not... It's just artificially rare. It's not true value. But then with the blockchain technology, give it a unique signature
Yes, however, this signature would be like just deciding that this object has value and the other doesn't. It would be a decision to decide that this object is valuable. The blockchain signature would make it unique, but what makes it unique? It's the signature itself. So it would just be that this object had a decision made upon it to have this signature and to make it valuable. However, this decision must be based in something that has something to do with reality. If it's just a pure decision, then this is just randomly deciding that this object has value and another doesn't. If we had such a unique blockchain certified unique object, could it be considered authentic? Yes, it could in theory, as long as it's not a copy and it's proven beyond reasonable doubt. With the coming technology of quantum computing and quantum encryption, there definitely will be a foolproof method of authentication. So the authentication is real, even if the object to which the authentication is linked could be potentially copied. One cannot argue with this. Who's to say it's any different from the Prada insignia found on their shoes or t-shirts? Just because the t-shirt can be copied potentially does not mean the authentic Prada t-shirt has no value. This in turn brings us to the question, what is the difference between value and splendor? The two very often overlap, but they're not synonymous. Splendor depends on more than one parameter, and this podcast here isn't a States of Value podcast. It's a States of Splendor one. Therefore, the reason why we're talking about quantum computing encryption in a podcast about custom-made and custom-designed objects is that recent technology has very much democratized custom making. 3D printing and the likes makes custom-designed objects much more easily created, but also much more easily copied. This thus has great influence on these objects' intrinsic value, as well as, you guessed it, their intrinsic splendor. All of the time keeping in mind that at least half of the splendor is created by the perception of the beholder. So this is what we're examining in this podcast, where you're more than welcome to participate. Let's recapitulate a little, because this is quite a complex subject. Let's say that we have an object. It is clear that we can have a handcrafted object that has splendor because of all its different qualities. Now, if we have an object that is coming entirely from the virtual world, such as, for example, a 3D printed object, taking into consideration that a 3D printed object can be reproduced, can this said object have value? Well, now that blockchain technology can certify that an object is unique, not possible to copy or forge, yes, this said object can definitely have value. Much like a piece of paper on its own has no value, but if it's certified as representing value, such as a dollar bill, definitely it does have value. But does it actually have splendor? It could probably have some splendor. It starts having some splendor at the second when it starts to have some quality, such as beauty or any other type of appreciable quality. And then the object actually does start to have some splendor. As we just said, if this object has some beauty or some quality to it, this quality is in direct relation to an earthly reality, being that somebody finds it beautiful, for example. Now, let's get back to this reflection here. Terroir is much like nature's own custom-made. It's the reflection of it that immediately makes its products authentic and unique. The intervention of the human hand only adds more authenticity to the already meaningful, unique, objective and subjective signature of terroir. So, to resume, the authenticity of an object could be rendered in theory by AI. However, the relative value of this AI authentified object would most probably be much less than that of an object authentified by the intervention of the hand of craftsmanship or the intervention of nature or terroir. This is because of the rarity and work that goes into the organic, natural forms of authentication, craftsmanship, and or terroir. AI has the potential of producing whatever it just produced, even if authentified, to an infinite number, limited only by resources or by artificial, arbitrary limitation, which is not the same reality at all. It doesn't matter if it can be absolutely perfectly reproduced. It doesn't even matter if it can be surpassed. Let's take, for example, a bottle of wine. If a bottle of wine is a superb bottle of wine, and let's say you have your grandfather that gave you a bottle of wine, he put it in a treasure chest somewhere, and he gave it for you when you graduated, and he said, let's drink this bottle in 10 years. Let's just say that there's some quantum computer that can be able to molecularly identically reproduce this bottle, like the same exact fingerprint. Would this bottle be the same? Well, no, it wouldn't, because it would not be the bottle that your grandfather gave to you and put in a treasure chest for 10 years. It would be the same thing, but it would not be the one that your grandfather gave to you. So it doesn't even matter if it could be surpassed by an even greater product. This is what authenticity is. In the world of collector's items, luxury items, great cuisine, great works, it is knowing that it's the real thing, it's authenticity, that counts. However, authenticity exactly has to have a basis in reality, in earthly reality. Authenticity should be aiming to recognize quality of some sort. We should not try to artificially inflate its value by drowning it in a sea of fakes either. And think about it, if you have an object and you want to make it its value go up, you can also drown it in a sea of fakes and have its value go up by contrast. Authenticity is its own measure. It's not comparative in its intrinsic, essential nature. There has to be a reason for which a product is authentified other than a decision based solely on decreeing that it has value. If not, it's just as decreeing that this piece of paper has value, and it would have value, but it would not have splendor as such. The idea of the high value of a custom-made product comes from the fact that the buyer or owner sees the said custom-made product as the reflection of his or her idea of utility or beauty or value. This obviously instantly creates a bond between the originator of the custom idea for the product and the actual product. So when you have a custom-made product, there is a bond that's created between the originator of the idea for the custom-made product and the product. This is why the custom-made product has a higher value. This has historically been quite costly to produce, especially ever since the advent of the domination of markets by mass-produced goods. However, in the late 2010s, there's a paradigm shift that suddenly makes custom-made more widely accessible. This is mainly because of new design software, new machinery, and most of all, 3D printing that eliminates the need for injection molding. This new situation means a very large opening for more easily creating unique things using technology, but not necessarily mass producing them. This is a somewhat fringe sector of our society, known as the avant-garde. That is the first wave of domestication of new styles, schools of thought, techniques, and technologies. In the digital age, The avant-garde has been the one that both inscribed the new standards and practices in socially integrating new technologies and also creating a sector of humanized or custom-made technological activity. I'll give you an example. In the 1980s and 1990s, the marketplace was increasingly dominated by mass-produced goods. This meant that there was an increasing rarity of custom-made products. The products, music, aesthetics became very uniform and standardized thanks to technology. In the 90s, a certain subculture in the industrialized nations began to re-engineer part of its capacity to produce a non-standardized production, often reflecting the tastes of the informal group making it. This was the essence of many subcultures and was the essence of what is known as the cyberpunk movement. The domestic use of computers was by the 90s and the 80s already well established. And thus this movement aimed to reclaim technology as a means of production to produce non-standardized content responding to individual or a given group's specifications. This movement gave birth to many subcultures. And one of the most significant ones in relation to technology was the acid house and rave subcultures in the 1990s and the 1980s. So these movements took electronic instruments that were used to make mainstream and advertising music, and they were reclaimed to make underground, specific niche music. Electronic software was giving more and more possibilities of custom making products, reclaiming graphic tools used for commercial and institutional purposes and reclaiming them to make non-standardized communication tools or art. In each of these cases, a piece of technology was integrated into domestic use. To phrase it differently, they were colonizing technological soulless standardized space and giving it a soul, giving it a certain splendor. The penultimate illustration of this act was probably the holding of true underground raves. Out of the park of soulless, standardized industrial spaces, one was picked for reasons of practicality and aesthetics and rendered custom-made. This is the actual act of custom-made, but on a different scale. So during the process, the industrial space, it could be a warehouse, it could be some kind of soulless concrete space. This industrial space was not masked. Rather, its industrial nature was integrated into the aesthetics of the party, revealing a hidden side of its potential and complementing it with harmoniously compatible techno music, techno visuals, and techno dress. During the all-night dance symphony, the previously faceless industrial space, amid smoke, dust from the dancers' silver sneakers, and perpetual techno beats and modulations, was given a soul and sometimes a quasi-legendary status. And thus there was a certain splendor that emanated from it. People would say, hey, do you remember that space? That was a space where there was that legendary party. And all of a sudden, the soulless space came to have a history and a certain soul. So the soulless industrial space was kind of custom made by an act of the humans. There is such an example of this that is even provable, and we can think about Detroit. Detroit was one of the cities where the acid house movement first started, but then there was also the techno movement that really got up some steam in that city. And of course Detroit was known for the industrial spaces. There was a lot of automotive activity there, and there was one old factory that was known as the Packard factory site. And the Packard factory site was the site of legendary parties. It was refurbished and custom redesigned to hold a legendary party there. Such events took place there that the Packard warehouse became legendary, and there was even music that was composed by a certain artist known as Plastic Man, and he composed music in specific memory of the Packard space. You can even look it up. Look up the artist Plastic Man, and I suggest you listen to Packard, which is an ode to that industrial space. The art of custom made is quite close to the art of handcraft made. It's linked to the act of making something one's own. The art of custom making is in 2019 still present in the domain of jewelry, architecture, fashion, furniture, and hospitality, for example. There is, however, a recent game changer, and that's computer technology. It's not so recent right now, actually. In 2019, now in 2020, the new decade coming along, 3D printing, sound and graphic design software are making the art of custom making more broadly accessible. So now, a new very actual chic is the creation and use of custom-made goods such as clothes, nifty seats, chairs, tables, but all sorts of plastic-based objects that are able to be produced with a 3D printer. Will these objects be able to be deemed authentic and having splendor, as they, by definition, be copied infinitely and perfectly? So as we saw in the previous podcast, SOS Podcast number 7, Splendor Within the Object, objects made on the assembly line seldom transpire any splendor. However, if they have some historical significance, or if they have some sentimental significance for the eye of the beholder, then there's instantly some splendor that is naturally created. So when we're talking about 3D printing, this new technology helps us use the assembly line in such a versatile and precise way that it makes custom-made products, and it's almost thus possible to render them custom-made in an authentically unique way, which gives it soul, splendor, an object that will bonify itself upon its passage, its navigation through the sea of time. So this brings us to the natural solution of the possibility of the application of a natural authentication by human hand, or by the signature of terroir, the natural signature, to a technological object. This hybrid way is probably a good adapted way of customizing and authentifying technological or virtual objects. Technology is rendering custom-made more accessible, but in this age of abundance, the Nec Plus Ultra will probably be the natural authentic signature on a technological or non-technological object. This signature is the same element as the act of transforming the soulless, industrial, serially produced space and customizing it for a dance event, human experience, thus rendering the space unique. An object's splendor can be of varying deepness. History and events, craftsman intervention, natural signature, blockchain signature, all of these have varying influence on the resulting splendor and authenticity. So the process of customization is not unlike the process of authentication, of inducing palpable, qualifiable authenticity. Which brings us to the age-old question, what is the difference between illusion and truth? But this is a highly philosophical question that will definitely not be discussed in the SOS podcasts. However, this kind of subject is the one that could be discussed within the club of our patrons who support our work in our philosophical clubs that are accessible through Patreon, or depending on the time at which you're listening to this podcast, the appropriate portal for those who contribute to the perennity of our craft. This is not exactly the same subject, but it is interesting that the custom-made way of producing often coincides with the refurbishing potential. Refurbishing is a little bit similar to the act of customizing. Unauthentic, serially made objects without a story are often thrown out after a relatively short period of time. However, authentic or custom-made products or objects often have an intrinsic quality. That quality will justify its refurbishing after a few years in order to conserve it and permit it to pass through time. Now you can say, if we have some old cars, the old cars can be refurbished and made into a magnificent object, but these cars were first serially produced. Yes, they were serially produced, but the fact that they went through time makes them rarer and rarer, because with the years there's less and less of these cars, and if one finds one in a junkyard, there is the factor of rarity that makes its value go up. Refurbishing, restoring, is also a fine line of work. A fine line between Pimp My Ride, which is customization, and shows like Graveyard Cars or Iron Resurrection or Cuban Chrome. Cuban Chrome is an interesting show that features the cars of the 50s that are quite popular in Cuba. If you go in Cuba, you're going to see that there are many, many cars that date from the 1950s and that are, through artisanal means, kept running until today, and they're very, very beautiful. It's quite impressive to see. So these cars have a certain value to them, definitely. Today, to illustrate one example of custom made that design software now makes possible, let's go to Dano Brown. Dano Brown custom makes action figures. He makes action figures based on the Nintendo world. You can find some of his action figures are based on Dr. Mario, Zombies Ate My Neighbors, Paperboy. There's even a figurine of Bob Ross from The Joy of Painting. It's figurines that he makes that are not really for sale, but exceptionally some are sold on his Instagram page. And those who own one don't simply own a Let's Dance, Elmo, or a G.I. Joe figurine. They own a technological object, a 3D printed object, which is in theory reproducible infinitely, but however it's designed and painted by the craftsman. That's a good example of hybrid splendor. So it is possible for splendor and technology to go hand in hand. As I mentioned more than once in this podcast, as well as the Stuff of Legends podcast, at least half of the splendor of a phenomenon is created by the eye of the observer. Many past manifestations of splendor, big and small, have become legends, in part because of the hindsight that shed light on their nearly forgotten reality. The Hindsight chronicle will select a lesser-known phenomenon of the past, focus on it, and hopefully shed some light on it. Of course, feel free to submit your suggestions for future Hindsight Chronicles. We'll be giving a priority to our patrons, of course, but all of your suggestions will be considered. Today's Hindsight Chronicle subject is Fallingwater. Fallingwater. What a poetic name. This name stems from the tradition that still exists today of naming notable pieces of land or houses. So Fallingwater is a house, quite famous house actually, but not so much as to be part of popular culture. Fallingwater House is definitely one that exudes splendor. It's located in Pennsylvania, about 45 minutes from the city of Pittsburgh. It's a house built in the American modernist style and period. Therefore, if you came upon the house without knowing about it beforehand, you would think it was built relatively recently because it has quite innovative lines. Actually, it was built in 1935. Fallingwater is one of the, if not the, most beautiful work of the great American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. It was built for Edgar J. Kaufman Sr., a prominent businessman, owner and director of the now departed Kaufman's department store. They had a plot of land near Pittsburgh, which included a small waterfall, and they had a cabin, which they would regularly visit and go for outdoors activities and sunbathing. When the cabin that he and his wife had there started to deteriorate, they famously decided to build a splendid house, and thus, through their son, they contacted Frank Lloyd Wright to have their house, their dream house, well, one of their dream houses, designed by him. Fallingwater is magnificent. It's built sitting atop a waterfall, and the house kind of grows over it. It has multiple levels, and its shape is very difficult to accurately describe because of its modern yet organic nature. The house was definitely built to be one with the surrounding nature. The house's look is modernist, yet incorporates stone from a nearby quarry, adding to its character. Its outside is most definitely unique, and without the shadow of a doubt, a true complement to the surrounding nature. It could actually be considered as if the house is part of the landscape and part of the scenery. While the outside is beautiful, the inside is amazing as well. The materials are arranged in a splendid modernist aesthetic, yet their nature is in continuity with the surrounding forest. In the living room, for example, Frank Lloyd Wright incorporated, amongst other things, a boulder that was encrusted in the land. Originally, he had planned to cut this boulder and make it level with the floor, but since this boulder was one on which the family usually sat on and sunbathed, he decided to actually leave it as such, so the rock actually protrudes into the living room. The rock stands in the earth outside, yet peaks inside the living room, becoming a part of the room and the house. And Frank Lloyd Wright did this to create a kind of link between the outside and the inside, a continuity. This beautiful house was graciously donated to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy by Edgar Kaufman Jr. It's still today celebrated by the people who visit it year after year. It's actually open to visitors. One can see in the strong vertical and horizontal lines the influences of Frank Lloyd Wright and actually of Edgar Kaufman Sr. First of all, the waterfall. Then the hill behind the house, a touch of inspiration from Japanese architecture. A cave effect was sought after. Many details were thought of to link the more technological elements of the house with the natural ones in a way that's seamless. Fallingwater is a magnificent house. It was estimated, first project was estimated to cost $35,000 at the time. Its cost was in fact $155,000. In 2018 dollars, that means about $2.8 million. Now, what's flabbergasting is what the restoration cost was. We talked today in this podcast number 8 about custom design and refurbishing. In this Fallingwater restoration, this is actually a grand example of refurbishing and restoration. Fallingwater's 2001 restoration cost $11.5 million, more than 5 times the cost of the actual construction of the house. All in all, Fallingwater is today a living part of Pennsylvania's culture and heritage. It's really a true wonder, and it's quietly nestled in the woods, a place you would never expect to stumble upon such a house. If ever you go in the Pittsburgh area, I highly recommend you should definitely visit Fallingwater. And today, in this SOS podcast number 8, today we have also a Splendor show and tell. It was started in the last podcast, podcast number 7, and there were 4 objects. This podcast we have one simple item. It's one nifty hat. It's what's known as a boater. This is not one from the 1920s here, as you can see, or the 1940s when this hat was very much in style. It's one that is made in 2019. It is, however, an authentic boater hat. It's made by hand and according to the original specifications. So these hats were known originally as boaters or cannotiers, and they've been worn since the late 19th century by men and women. It fell out of use in the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s. But today, as straw hats are making a comeback, boaters can sometimes be seen on the street worn both by women and men. The modern boater, or cannotier as it was once known, has a medium-sized brim and an angled top. It's usually worn in hot, sunny weather. It's a hat that's supposed to block the sun. In the USA, there was such a thing as a straw hat day. There's kind of a tradition in Europe for the boater, which has its own aesthetic, and there's an American tradition which has a different aesthetic. The American tradition of the boater is associated to things like barbershop quartets, for example. And in Europe, it's more of a chic, quite fashionable type of hat. So in USA, where they celebrated the Straw Hat Day, they also had the Felt Hat Day. The Straw Hat Day was sometime in May, and the Felt Hat Day was sometime in September or October, whenever the weather started to become colder. As soon as the weather cooled, one had to wear the felt hat on the appointed date. And as soon as the straw hat day came out, well, they had to wear the straw hat. So this hat here, as you can see, is made of natural straw and what's known as grosgrain ribbon. It's a type of textile that was made at the time, and this is the exact same textile. This cannotier was made in Italy. This hat is actually quite famous. One image comes to mind when thinking of the boater hat and the cannotier. It's a famous painting by Renoir, the famous painter. Auguste Renoir. He made a very famous painting that's called the Déjeuner des Cannotiers. The Déjeuner des Cannotiers actually means the boater's lunch, depicting young boaters having lunch by the river, all the while flirting here and there with damsels. Today still, boaters are a unique kind of style and can be relatively frequently seen atop hipster heads, amongst others. It's one that's perfect for very hot weather. For my part, I think I prefer it to the regular baseball cap. So that's the Splendor show and tell for today, the boater hat. That's all for today's SOS podcast number 8. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you were intrigued by it. Remember to submit to us pictures and or a video of any object you deem worthy of appearing in the Splendor show and tell. Send us the object in 5 or 6 pictures, as well as some video if you can with your phone, and the object's story, and we will showcase it on a Splendor show and tell. Also, for those who wish to contribute a subject to the Hindsight chronicle, please feel free to do so at the same address as you do for the SOS show and tell. That's info@statesofsplendor.com. info@statesofsplendor.com. If you were intrigued by the philosophical ramifications of today's subject and would like to join our private club's philosophical discussions, you can do so by supporting our work on Patreon or on whichever support site we're on at the time you're playing this podcast, or directly on statesofsplendor.com. Our private philosophy club is now open to all members of the Fellow Traveler tier. It's of course a very informal philosophy club, so it's really open to all who just wish to participate. We'll see you next time for the SOS Podcast number 9. This one will be about the global and the local. Keep on visiting statesofsplendor.com for our regular videos and articles. I hope everybody has a great and an inspiring week. See you next time. Bye-bye.